Adolf Eichmann, the notorious Nazi who escaped justice for 15 years before his trial brought global understanding to the term Holocaust. Under oath, Eichmann insisted he was a middle manager with no blood on his hands.
Dass ich nie einen Menschen getötet habe, dass ich nie einen Menschen erschlagen habe, dass ich nie einen Menschen geschlagen habe.
Is this the truth, or were his words all lies? Most people from my generation don't understand how over 70 years ago, a small group of Nazis could start a war that killed 60 million people. I want to find out, and to help me, I'm going to use playing cards. Today, they're used by both the military and law enforcement to help identify their targets. But nobody has ever put together a pack of cards for the most notorious group of killers in history. Working with experts, I want to know where each of these Nazis rank in the hierarchy of evil. My name is James Ellis. This is Hitler's Most Wanted. It is interesting weighing up the different sides of this. I find this is an extremely tough one because he played such an integral role to the Nazi genocide, but at the same time, because he was a cog in that machine, maybe he was replaceable.
What I find most interesting about Eichmann is the pedestrian nature to which he went about his work. To him, it was just automated. He went to work, he did his job, he went back home.
You have to remember, he wasn't a senior Nazi. That uniform is that of an SS lieutenant colonel. That's not that high. It's middle ranking.
When anti-Semitic measures were increased and persecution was ramped up, he was on board. A genocidal regime doesn't just need speechmakers, doesn't just need people ranting at the podium, it doesn't just need politicians, it needs organizers, people who make plans and carry them out.
Eichmann was one of several senior Nazis to escape punishment after World War II. He vanished into thin air before being spotted in Argentina in the late 1950s. He was captured in secret and brought to Israel to face his accusers. His trial lasted for 4 months and was watched by millions around the world. Throughout, Eichmann claimed he was purely an administrator who played no direct part in the mass genocide his Nazi bosses carried out. I want to know if there is any truth to his defense, so I've come to Germany to start looking into Eichmann's story at a place that helped take him down.
That's the map. Nearly every spot here is a crime scene.
Wow. Jens Rommel is a prosecutor at the Central Office for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes on the outskirts of Stuttgart.
It's an amazing visual representation of the scale and scope of Nazi crimes.
And it's only a part of the scale.
So it must be a very daunting task for you then, because you've got all these crime scenes here, and you're trying to bring the people who are responsible for this to justice.
It's an enormous task for a small office like ours.
70 years on, Jens and his team are still chasing down suspected war criminals from the Third Reich. They have identified some 28,000 war crime sites, but with many of the men and women under suspicion now in their 90s, time is running out.
These crimes happened 7 decades ago, but your office is investigating these crimes today.
Well, of course, these are historical events during World War II, but what we are doing are current investigations because the defendants, some of them, are still alive, and it's also important for the victims or their relatives. For them, that's a current issue. Let's move to the card index room. We have 1.7 million index cards with names, locations, and military units.
1.7 million?
1.7 million. More than 700,000 names of defendants or witnesses.
From Hitler down to the lowliest thug, the details of their crimes are recorded here.
So I'm interested in finding out more about Eichmann. Do you have anything on him here?
Well, there should be a file concerning him, but first we have to check on the index cards. That's his index card. You can see we have a lot of cards concerning him, 8 in total.
8 cards. Is that unusual?
That's unusual because he was such a prominent figure responsible for a lot of victims. You have his personal data, Adolf Eichmann, and his actual position as the head of a unit in the Reichssicherheitshauptamt responsible for the killings and the robbery of Jewish citizens.
But as a bureaucrat who spent the Second World War behind a desk, he wasn't well known among Nazi hunters when the conflict ended.
In post-war Germany, the process of denazification undertaken by the Allies quickly became a lower priority than preparing for the coming conflict with the Soviet Union. So there was little appetite in post-war Germany to find and prosecute war criminals, especially those who weren't at the very top of the regime.
This allowed Eichmann, along with many others, to slip through the net. It really blows my mind. Hundreds of thousands of people have blood on their hands, and some of them are still out there. Eichmann, however, was one of the highest profile escapees to be caught. The arrest brought to light his astonishing story. To find out more about how he got his start with Nazism, I'm heading 620 kilometers northeast to Germany's capital, Berlin. Historian Dr. Stephanie Fischer is taking me to where Eichmann's career under Adolf Hitler would flourish. He actually went to the same high school as Adolf Hitler, is that true?
Yes.
Really?
Yeah, it seems to be kind of surprising for us, right? And we immediately start thinking, is there a connection? But it just doesn't seem that they met us.
Yeah, it wasn't like it was a school notorious for, say, radicalizing people or anything like that.
Not that we would know.
Born in 1906, Eichmann is 17 years younger than Hitler, so their paths never crossed in the halls of their high school in Linz, Austria.
Eichmann was a nondescript adult, and he had a nondescript childhood. He left vocational school without completing his course of study as a mechanic. He worked with his father. He worked as a sales clerk. Incredibly nondescript and undistinguished.
And do we know why Eichmann became so interested in right-wing politics?
I think what he really finds appealing about is this idea of comradeship, of belonging, having a group of male bonding and being together and drinking beer and having common goals about how to change the world. And part of it is, of course, anti-Semitism.
So why was anti-Semitism part of his worldview?
As crazy as it may sound to us today, it wasn't something very uncommon at the time. Like right after World War I, among leftists and rightists as well, we would have a high degree of anti-Semitism. It wasn't something unique to the Nazi movement at the time, but the Nazism they pushed it to a new degree.
The Nazis' propaganda machine spouting Jewish conspiracies feeds right into Eichmann's pre-existing anti-Semitism. He joins the SS in 1932.
In 1933, Eichmann was sent to Dachau for paramilitary training, and he wasn't very excited by it. He requested a transfer to the SD, the security service of the SS, and a transfer to Berlin. He was ambitious, and he wanted to rise up in the party, but not through the military route.
In Berlin, he is posted to the very center of Hitler's security apparatus. I actually have a picture of the original building.
Oh, let's take a look.
Yeah. So this is a photo of the building that was standing here before.
Exactly. So this used to be the headquarters of the SS, the security service SD, Gestapo.
The SS was Hitler's security service, the Gestapo his secret police, and the SD the intelligence wing where Eichmann worked.
The SD is going to become one of the most powerful organizations in the Third Reich. It's there to gather every scrap of intelligence about every enemy. Now, those enemies don't just include, foreign powers, they also include the other perceived enemies, such as Jews, communists, members of the church, Freemasons, you name it. Anybody Hitler doesn't like, they are a fair target for the SD.
What were his responsibilities?
He was very much involved in collecting data from Jews, but in particular in setting up emigration plans for how Jews should leave Germany. It's a major project. I mean, just think about it. This is where he proves to be a very good bureaucrat.
The Nazis' first attempt at removing Jews from Germany involved racist, restrictive policies that pushed them to emigrate. Eichmann was given the task of coordinating this effort through the SD, and he dove headfirst into the job.
Why is it that he is willing to work in an institution that is persecuting people? Like, why is it that, he comes in, he gets a desk job, I understand that he wants to get away from the military service, but then he's persecuting Freemasons, and then he's persecuting Jews. Like, what is it about him that drives him to do that?
We can only read the documents we have, and the documents show that he chose to work there, and it was not something forced on him. So he made a clear choice to work in this department that persecuted Jews.
At his trial, Eichmann conceded that this was where he first honed his skills as an expert administrator, though remained adamant he was nothing more.
Das waren meine inzwischen mir angelernten Fähigkeiten auf dem Gebiet des Auswanderungswesens. So konnte ich sehr wohl jene Zeit auf diesem Gebiet als Spezialist gelten.
But the historical record proves there was much more to his story. In 1938, after Germany annexes Austria, Eichmann is posted to Vienna. He sets up the Central Office for Jewish Emigration and gets straight to work hounding the Jews in the country where he grew up.
He was an expert in what we would call putting the squeeze on people. Eichmann took steps, especially in Vienna, to compel emigration, to make life for Jews so difficult and so unlivable, and to have the threat of terror hanging over them, that they would have no choice but to find some way to flee the country.
Eichmann dreams up financial scams to seize Jewish property and freeze their assets. In May 1938, he boasts to his colleagues, "I have them completely in my hands. They dare not take one step without first consulting me." In just 1 year, Eichmann forces 100,000 Jews to leave Austria. It's an act no one should endure, not back then, nor today.
Dass keiner freiwillig ihre Heimatland und wo man aufgewachsen ist und ihre Umgebung verlässt.
I'm on a quest to figure out where Adolf Eichmann fits into Hitler's hierarchy of evil. I've come to Berlin, the city where Eichmann honed his skills overseeing the forced emigration of Jews from Europe. At his trial in 1961, Eichmann claimed he wasn't high enough in the chain of command to have any influence over what happened to them.
Denn dazu war mein Dienstgrad zu klein und meine Dienststellung zu gering.
But his success in pushing thousands of Jews out of Austria suggests otherwise. In fact, Eichmann and the Nazis were just getting started.
Eichmann's role in the SD is to identify ways in which the Jews can be got rid of. What we're looking at is forced emigration, plunder of wealth and property.
With Eichmann's help, from the mid-1930s onwards, Jews and other perceived enemies of the state were being persecuted to such a degree they had no choice but to leave their homelands, only to discover their situation became even worse.
There was no place for Jewish refugees to go. Many countries' doors were closed to them.
In one famous example, in May 1939, an ocean liner carrying some 900 Jewish refugees left Germany in search of a home. The St. Louis was denied entry to Cuba, the United States, and Canada, and forced to return to Europe. Over 250 passengers were later killed in concentration and death camps. I want to find out what fleeing that kind of tyranny feels like. Since the Second World War ended, Germany has become far more welcoming to refugees.
How long have you lived in Germany?
Ich bin seit mehr als 38 Jahren in Deutschland.
And though I can't speak to those who were aboard the liner, I can speak to people who've endured similar torment.
Ich bin ein Jahr nach iranischer Revolution.
Hamid Nafzari is the director of Berlin's Society for Iranian Refugees, a group that supports newly arrived asylum seekers.
Die neue politische Machthaber im Iran und neue politische Lage war für mich unerträglich. Ich konnte nicht mehr aushalten und deshalb bin ich mal rausgekommen.
After the revolution in 1979, Iran devolved into totalitarian rule. Persecution of political opponents and minority groups became government policy. Just as Adolf Eichmann used the terror apparatus to push Jews out, Iran's leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, intimidated his people into submission. Many were forced to abandon the country of their birth.
Why do refugees come to Germany? What conditions are they fleeing?
Sehen sich gezwungen, ihre Heimat zu verlassen, sei es politisch, Hunger, keine wirtschaftliche oder Lebensperspektive, aber auch viele wegen ihrer Geschlecht, als Beispiel Frauen, Homosexuellen, als Beispiel Iraner, mehr wegen religiöser Diktatur, Unfreiheiten, Syrien, Bürgerkrieg. Wenn sie aus Afghanistan kommen, da haben die de facto keine Perspektive. Entweder wenn die aus Dörfern sind und so, werden die eventuell von Taliban und anderen Paramiliten.
In 2015, more than 1 million refugees fleeing civil war, political persecution, and economic hardship flooded into Europe. In response, Germany opened its borders.
How do you think Germany's history affects their attitude towards refugees?
Ich glaube sehr viel in Bezug auf die Vergangenheit von Deutschland, sich verpflichtet fühlen, sich für die Minderheiten, für Flüchtlinge einzusetzen, dass keiner freiwillig ihr Heimatland und wo man aufgewachsen ist und ihre Umgebung verlässt.
The kind of state-sanctioned persecution Hamid is describing resonates with Eichmann's work. In 1939, the Germans invaded Poland. This gives Eichmann an even greater challenge.
It becomes increasingly obvious that the more territory you conquer, the more Jews are going to be under your control. So when the Nazis do march into Poland, suddenly they've got 3 million more Jews. Now, what are you going to do with them?
Ever the problem solver, Eichmann's policies escalate from forced emigration to deportation. And one of his pet projects for what to do with the Jews was truly bizarre.
If you want to get to the roots of basically crazy Nazi thinking, look no further than the Madagascar plan. Big island off the coast of Africa. Nazis look at the map and go, well, why don't we just dump the Jews there?
Eichmann assembles a task force to plan mass deportations from Nazi-held Europe to the French colony. But the plan's impracticality during wartime doomed it to failure.
It's completely insane. There's no infrastructure there, and of course, it makes no sense. If you're going to dump a load of people on that island, well, actually, you might as well kill them. Someone makes that mental leap, and that's what's going to happen.
This is a planned genocide through an industrialized mass murder program. It's deeply disturbing.
The next leg of my journey into Adolf Eichmann's story brings me to a villa in the leafy Berlin suburb of Wannsee. The setting is beautiful, yet the events that took place here over 75 years ago were anything but.
So this really is a stunning property.
Many people tell me that they are shocked by the contrast between the beauty of this place and the horrific history which we tell in our exhibition.
Today, this former SS guest house is a memorial site for European Jews murdered in the Holocaust. Hans Christian Josch is the director.
Now, this property is most notorious for a meeting that took place here in January 1942. Can you tell me what that meeting was for?
The basic idea of the conference was to coordinate government offices on what the Nazis euphemistically called the Endlösung der Judenfrage, the final solution of the Jewish question.
Undoubtedly, many conferences took place in the Third Reich throughout the war about how genocide was going to be enacted. The one that we know the most of, because the minutes of it were discovered, is the Wannsee Conference. This was a business meeting discussing, sales targets. What it looked like to an outsider. You had a map, you had numbers, and you had where those numbers were going to go. But of course, what all those numbers and maps represented was industrial slaughter.
This was where a small group of key Nazis agreed to the coordinated mass extermination of European Jews. Eichmann was among them. At his trial, Eichmann acknowledged he attended the Wannsee Conference, but claimed he played no part in that decision. He even went as far as saying he was opposed to the violence.
Ich hatte im Hinblick auf Juden damals nur jene Obliegenheiten zu erfüllen, die mit der Auswanderung zusammenhingen. Und zwar lediglich in fahrplanmäßiger Hinsicht, das heißt transporttechnischer Hinsicht. Aber ich hatte an keine blutige Lösung gedacht und nicht an eine solche gewaltsame Lösung gedacht.
Of all the claims he made in court, his fate hinged on this one more than any other.
So what was Eichmann's role in the conference?
Eichmann was the head of the desk for Jewish affairs in the Reichssicherheitsamt, in the Reich's main security office, and he was therefore in charge of transport.
All of the deportations from Nazi-ruled Europe to concentration and death camps in the East were overseen by Adolf Eichmann.
What was it about him that gave him such an important role in the Nazi genocide?
Eichmann took a lot of initiative, that he would actually interpret orders from his superiors very sort of flexible way, that he even had been reprimanded sometimes for being overzealous.
Eichmann worked tirelessly to maximize the efficiency of the train timetables. The gas chambers at Auschwitz couldn't keep up with the number of people he was sending. By 1944, even with the Allies advancing on all fronts, Eichmann continued to wage his own war against the Jews.
When the deportation of the Hungarian Jews started in spring 1944, he was actually overstepping Himmler's orders and sort of developed his own ambition in deporting as many Jews as possible.
As the Third Reich begins to crumble, he forces thousands of Hungarian Jews to march to the camps. When Heinrich Himmler ordered a stop to the death marches, Eichmann disobeyed.
Eichmann carried this out with great efficiency. He saw extermination as a task to be carried out, as a logistical problem. But we shouldn't forget, he saw it as a problem that he was happy to solve.
He's an enforcer, he's an administrator, he is the man who makes the Holocaust happen.
So it wasn't just a case that he was working in an office and overseeing or being involved in the genocide. It was something that he really was passionate about, that he saw it as his mission to try and eradicate the Jewish population of Europe.
Yeah, he wanted to kill as many Jews as possible. This was his war aim, basically.
Inside is the evidence that tears apart Eichmann's defense. His own paper trail proves he was complicit in mass murder.
It's really chilling to be actually looking at the documents, because Eichmann was the one that put these minutes together. It's a list of the number of Jews in Europe that the Nazis have identified. We know that they managed to exterminate 6 million Jews, but this list contains 11 million, and that's because they've taken into account England, Ireland, Spain, Turkey. It just sort of shows the scale of what they were planning. It's deeply disturbing, just revolting.
Eichmann saw these people not as human, but as cattle, livestock being sent to the abattoir.
The largest deportation in 1943 had 1,758 Jews on one train.
1,758 on one train.
In my quest to determine Adolf Eichmann's place in Hitler's hierarchy, I've seen the evidence that proves he was complicit in genocide. Now, I want to know just how deep his commitment was to carrying it out.
So where are we?
We are at the train station of Grunewald, which is basically at Berlin's west end.
I'm with historian Josef Speer at the main departure point for Berlin Jews destined to die in Nazi gas chambers.
So the majority of Jews that were deported from Berlin were deported right where we're standing here.
Right.
Today, Grunewald Station is a Holocaust memorial. But during World War II, it was arguably one of the busiest stations in Europe, at least when it comes to mass murder.
So what are these here?
These are plaques that commemorate each and every deportation that left Berlin between 41 and 45. The largest deportation in 1943 had 1,758 Jews on one train.
1,758 on one train.
For 4 years, Berlin's Jews were rounded up, taken to Grunewald, and crammed into sealed railway cars. They were deprived of food and water and there was no sanitary facility other than a bucket. Many died on the trains themselves before they even reached the extermination camps.
What's so chilling to me standing on a platform in Berlin is that you see that we're not dealing with genocide on the battlefield. That had been happening, but we're dealing with genocide that's been planned. It's something that the state has decided to do in the most practical way possible.
They outsourced the killing to these murder factories, and then, of course, the question was, how do we facilitate this transportation? How do we get the Jews from Germany, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and so on? And that's where Eichmann comes in. That's where Eichmann is in charge in facilitating the kidnapping of families from their homes, forcing them onto trains, making sure that everything works well, the timetables, having the manpower, having the resources, having the trains on time to leave Berlin, to leave Paris, to leave Budapest, on the way to Auschwitz, for example.
At his trial, Eichmann was confronted by witness after witness. They all testified to his role in deporting Jews to their deaths.
dass Eichmann war derjenige, der alle Bestimmungen betreffend Juden getroffen hat, vorgeschlagen hat und auch sogar durchgeführt hat.
פתרון סופי. אז הוא קיבל את התפקיד לבצע את זה.
Despite the damning words, Eichmann continued to deny his direct involvement in their suffering.
So sind an diesen Sachen eine ganze Menge Personen, wenn ich mal so sagen will.
One of the most confusing things about Eichmann was his seeming normality. He comes across, at least, as just sort of your everyday person. That is scary to some extent because it suggests that that normal people might actually be capable of this level of atrocity.
Eichmann approaches his role within the final solution with the utmost zeal. I mean, he takes his job really seriously. And that's what makes him such a terrifying figure, because this is a big logistical exercise. His department is quite small, it's just a handful of people. Yet together, under Eichmann's stewardship, they manage to get all these people, these millions of people, sent to their deaths.
Now that we're approaching the end of the war, this is the beginning of 1945. And so the numbers are very small. These are the last Jews of Berlin, those who were trying to survive while hiding.
27th of March, 1945.
At this point in the war, the Third Reich is all but finished. Every Nazi knows it, including Eichmann, but he was determined to finish the job he started.
The last deportation that left Berlin, 18 Jews who almost made it. And then, in spite of everything, were still captured, and by fanatic Nazis, they were being deported right before the Soviets encircled Berlin.
That's less than a month and a half before the end of the war in Europe. This really hits things home for me because they're losing the war. It's the final months of the war. They're about to lose it, and yet they are still deporting Jews to death camps.
Indeed, they were losing the physical war, but for some Nazis, the war against the Jews was more important.
Eichmann's profound commitment to the final solution is nowhere more apparent than on this abandoned train platform. But he'd soon find himself unemployed. The Germans surrendered in May 1945. Hitler was dead, and Germany lay in ruins. Millions of displaced people jammed the roads of Europe, desperately trying to get home. Hidden among them were Nazi fugitives in disguise, including Adolf Eichmann.
After the defeat of Nazi Germany, Eichmann was actually briefly captured by the Americans, but he got away using a fake identity.
For the final chapter in Eichmann's story, I'm turning to historian Tobias Freimüller.
So we're in Spandau right now.
Yes, this is the neighborhood of Spandau.
He has the inside scoop on how Eichmann was finally brought to justice 15 years after the war ended.
And it became clear that the man was not his uncle, but it was, in fact, Eichmann himself.
I mean, that's just unbelievable.
Adolf Eichmann was a war criminal who evaded justice for over a decade. He'd hoped to live out his days in Argentina, but his capture in May 1960 changed all that. For the final leg of my journey, I've met up with historian Tobias Freimüller to find out how Eichmann's arrest played out and the impact it had on our understanding of what the Nazis did.
And this is actually the place where the synagogue was until it was destroyed in November 38. And what you see here is actually the names of the Jewish citizens of this neighborhood.
So these are the names of people that were deported?
Yes, exactly.
When the war ends, Eichmann's name is not on the list of top Nazis that the Allies are trying to track down, is he?
No, he's not. The Allies search for the top-ranking Nazis they know. His name is mentioned because it was clear from the very beginning that he was responsible for the deportations, but he was not seen as one of the leading figures who were brought before the court in the main Nuremberg trial.
In Argentina, Eichmann lived under an alias, but his wife and children still carried his name.
He spends, his days in Argentina drifting from menial job to menial job. He tries to make an Angora rabbit farm work. It doesn't work. He's working as a mechanic at a Mercedes-Benz factory. These aren't big jobs for a man who thinks, he deserves more.
Eichmann coped with his lowly place in the world by bragging about his past to other fascists. He also gave extensive interviews to another former SS officer turned journalist.
When he started giving these interviews in the 50s, the plan was to write a book and to publish a book where Eichmann would tell the truth about his history in the Third Reich, and he would publish it under his real name then.
One second, in the 50s he was going to write a book and he was going to talk about what he did and publish it. I find that extraordinary. But I suppose if you're that fanatical and you genuinely believed what you did was right, I suppose something that sounds as crazy as that now, to him, sounded like the logical thing to do.
Absolutely. He wanted to tell the truth from his point of view.
But it would be Eichmann's twisted version of the truth, no one else's. And these memoirs were never published.
So how was Eichmann ultimately apprehended?
It was in '57 when Fritz Bauer received a letter. Fritz Bauer was the state prosecutor of the state of Hesse, and he was known as one of the very few people in the judiciary in West Germany who would really fight for the prosecution of Nazi crimes. So he received a letter from Buenos Aires.
That letter was written by a Jew who'd escaped Nazi Germany in 1938. He'd just learned about his daughter's new boyfriend.
This new boyfriend turned out to be Klaus Eichmann, and it became clear that the man who lived with Klaus was not his uncle, but it was, in fact, Eichmann himself.
I mean, that's just unbelievable.
Fritz Bauer passed the tip on to Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service. During a daring operation in May 1960, agents kidnapped Eichmann from a Buenos Aires suburb and smuggled him back to Israel to stand trial.
It was a very, very special case. The trial in Jerusalem found a very huge echo in the media worldwide. It was the first trial at all who had such a focus on the Holocaust.
Eichmann's trial was watched by millions. The horrors inflicted on the Jews by the Nazis shocked the world.
Mein Bruder ist schon in Theresienstadt gestorben und meinen Sohn haben sie geführt nach Auschwitz.
We walked for 24 hours without food, and those who could not carry on were shot.
ראיתי ילדים מובלים להריגה. פעם אחת באו אנשי SS.
SS men arrived one morning and took the child away with them. Later, I learned that the child was thrown into the fire.
Until that point, I don't think that the world at large really knew what had happened. They knew there had been atrocities, they knew there had been killings, but they hadn't realized that the Holocaust, and it wasn't really called the Holocaust at this point, was actually this genocidal act.
You had survivors telling their stories in front of a global audience, and really for the first time, bringing narratives of the Holocaust and the systemic nature of persecution and genocide together in one place.
To have this laid out so clearly and to hear the testimonies and to see Eichmann in this glass box made a huge impression, especially on the younger generation, of course, who heard for the first time really what was the real nature of the Nazi crimes.
I think it's at the Eichmann trial where people really start to appreciate the mechanics and the machinery of the genocide. They realize that this isn't just something that just took place on a whim in camps. This was something that was organized, it was designed, it was literally built. Trains and timetables were literally drawn up, and people who were doing it were men like Eichmann.
The trial inspired Jews around the world to recall their own experiences of persecution and loss under the Nazis. It renewed calls for action to hunt down war criminals still on the run. It also forced Germans to confront their past.
So the German society had to learn that responsibility was to be found everywhere, within every bureaucratic system, within every family, and every soldier who took part in the war in the East had seen and properly done terrible things. And this took decades in Germany to really get through.
So the Eichmann's trial really opened up this period of understanding and taking responsibility for the atrocities that Germany had committed, and not just brush it under the carpet and say, oh, you know, Hitler and a few other guys were the people who did it all.
Absolutely.
What does Eichmann's performance at the trial tell us about him?
Well, it tells us pretty much everything that we know about him, finally, because there he was again and again making the argument that he only followed instructions, that he had to do what he did.
Eichmann played a fictitious role at that trial. He made himself out to be the little man. He made himself out to be the cog in the machine. He made himself out to be just the type of bureaucrat that all governments and indeed all dictatorships need if they are to function.
But everyone else in the courtroom saw right through him.
We know that he was very convinced of what he did. And until the very end of the war, he still tried to keep up the deportations, even if it was pretty clear that the war was lost.
Eichmann was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to die. He was hanged on May 31st, 1962. A coward to the end, he never once expressed remorse for his complicity in the murder of millions during the Second World War. Now it's time for me to figure out where this Nazi bureaucrat fits into Hitler's hierarchy.
Eichmann gets as close as I can imagine anyone getting to pure evil.
My travels to Germany have given me a much clearer picture of Adolf Eichmann's role in the Holocaust. Now it's up to us to find out where he fits in the hierarchy of evil. Using our unique system of playing cards, I want to determine where Eichmann ranks among Hitler's most wanted.
So what was it about his character and abilities that gave him such an important role in the Holocaust?
You know what he was? He was good at logistics, he was good at organization, and he was good at following where those lines led to their most cruel and horrible conclusions without batting an eye.
Well, I think the thing about Eichmann that I notice is how bureaucratic he was, how administrative he was. Or at least he tries to portray himself in that way, as a quite normal person just going about his business.
And that was certainly how he portrayed himself in the dock in Jerusalem in the 1960s. Well, what you have to remember about Eichmann is that he was a Gestapo officer, and he had an enormous amount of power in determining the mechanics of the Holocaust. He's sometimes called the architect of the Holocaust. I think that maybe some other characters were actually deserve that epithet. But what he did do was he helped manage it, and he managed it very, very fervently.
Eichmann's bureaucratic diligence wasn't just about following orders. To him, his job was everything, and he relished in the administration of terror.
Eichmann was there right from the very beginning. He was up there, exploring the options, whether all the Jews should be deported to Madagascar, and ultimately as to where they should be murdered.
And when the Nazis escalated from persecution to mass murder, he went to great lengths to keep the mechanics of genocide running smoothly.
The place that really struck me was Grunewald train station in Berlin, and this is where a large number of Berlin Jews were deported to the east to be murdered. And Eichmann was responsible for those deportations.
But the thing that was most disturbing about that place was learning that those deportations were happening right up until the final weeks of the war.
It was not incidental. They were diverting resources to it. And at the very end of the war, they ramped up the extermination in order to make sure there wouldn't be any witnesses. In Argentina, Eichmann cavorted with ex-Nazis and would-be Nazis and was quite proud of what he'd accomplished. He bragged about how many Jews he was able to deport to extermination.
You're absolutely right. And he actually said once, I will jump into my grave laughing that I killed 6 million Jews. You know, this was not a man who was in any way ashamed of what he had done.
So it's really frightening to grasp the fact that what he was doing, he believed was right. And he felt a conviction to the cause.
It wasn't so much that he believed what he was doing was wrong and did it anyway, like a psychopath would. He truly believed that his behavior was justified. Now, that doesn't necessarily make his behavior any less evil, but it is, again, scary to think that somebody can undertake immoral behavior and actually feel justified to do so.
Eichmann saw no moral quandary in the bureaucracy of genocide and his central role in it. That is what cements his place among Hitler's most hated disciples. So I'd like to come to a conclusion now of where you think he ranks in the Nazi hierarchy of evil. So Guy, we'll start with you.
Well, I'm going to put him down in the late teens, which may seem a little bit surprising considering he's this kind of household name amongst Nazis. Why? Yes, his personality is revolting. His anti-Semitism is pure evil. What he did was pure evil. But I think there would have been a lot of people who could have done that job in the Third Reich. So therefore, he doesn't really qualify for something much higher.
Anthony?
I think we all agree that Eichmann wasn't the faceless cog he portrayed himself as. But Eichmann gets as close as I can imagine anyone getting to pure evil. He didn't do this for fame, for money. He did this because he believed it was the right thing to do. His skill at that means that he has to rank a little higher, so I'm going to rank him at number 10.
I agree. I think he's necessary. I think his personality profile is required, and I think that his zeal demonstrates a pure evil. But I do, unfortunately, believe that that evil, that position, is replaceable. I rate him at 12.
So obviously the three of you have difference of opinion, but for me, I just can't get over the fact that he was responsible for the deaths of millions. I'm therefore going to agree with Matt's ranking, and he's at number 12. He's the queen of clubs. For his devotion to the logistics of the Holocaust and his unrelenting desire to deport all of Hungary's Jews to their deaths, Adolf Eichmann proves that even a bureaucrat can be responsible for great evil. Albert Speer, Hitler's scheming architect. He built the Führer's invincible image and sacrificed thousands to make his weapons of war. And when it was all over,
I swear by God,
he orchestrated one of the biggest cover-ups in history.
It's an interesting story to see how he got away with it and why people for many decades were prepared and even keen to believe what he said.
Most people from my generation don't understand how over 70 years ago, a small group of Nazis could start a war that killed 60 million people. I want to find out, and to help me, I'm going to use playing cards. Today, they're used by both the military and law enforcement to help identify their targets. But nobody has ever put together a pack of cards for the most notorious group of killers in history. Working with experts, I want to know where each of these Nazis rank in the hierarchy of evil. My name is James Ellis. This is Hitler's Most Wanted. Speer is one of those Nazis that people, especially of my generation, don't really know about. But he played such an integral role in the regime. Yet when it came to the end of the war, he managed to escape the noose. How did he manage to not get hung for his crimes?
He managed to convince those judges at Nuremberg, and he managed to convince the world at large that actually he was the gentleman Nazi. He did a few nasty, beastly things, but really he wasn't really one of the bad guys.
Speer wanted the world to believe that he was a technocrat, that he was swept along by the currents of history, that he wanted to do his job, be an architect, and didn't know about the atrocities that were going on.
In order to have a life pre-1945 and after 1945, it takes a certain amount of conviction, first of all, for that lie, and it also takes some resolve in order to live with it for that length of time.
So how do we separate what he did before the end of the war and the story that he told about what he did after the end of the war?
So you have to base your understanding of Speer on his concrete actions, not on the stories he told. The actions tell a very different story.
I want to understand Albert Speer's true role in Hitler's Third Reich. For that, I'm heading to Germany. I'm starting in the city that's synonymous with both the rise and fall of the Nazis, Nuremberg.
Where we are right now, this is known as the VIP rostrum.
I'm here with historian Kevin Hoskins at the site of one of Speer's earliest architectural projects, the Nazi Party rally ground, to find out how he became a Nazi and rose through the ranks.
The structure in the center, that's known as the Golden Hall. And on top of there was that big golden swastika that we've all seen blown up by the Americans a million times.
Oh, so it was on the top of that building?
The Americans blew that up on the 22nd of April, 1945.
Wow.
The swastika's destruction was a symbolic act of retribution. To let the world know that the Allies had finally defeated the Nazis. For almost 10 years, this was the beating heart of Germany's totalitarian regime, where the masses came to worship at the feet of Adolf Hitler. This grand monument to fascism was the brainchild of one man. But who exactly was Albert Speer, and how did he come to design it?
Speer came from an upper-middle-class family, a family of architects, and so Speer pursued architectural studies in the family tradition. Speer attended a speech by Hitler in 1930, and he was quite taken with Hitler, and he began to believe that Hitler could be a savior of the German people.
He joined the party in 1931. The way he got his start is he redesigned the Nazi Party headquarters in Berlin.
Speer's work caught the eye of Hitler's notorious minister of propaganda, Joseph Goebbels.
After the Nazis came to power in 1933, Goebbels had Speer redesign the propaganda ministry. By this time, he's starting to get noticed by Hitler.
He was given the commission to design the Nazi Party rally grounds, and that's where he really comes to Hitler's attention and really impresses him.
Speer's task was to create a structure that would transform Hitler the politician into Hitler the god.
This particular structure, the VIP rostrum, was actually copied from another great empire, namely the Greek Empire.
Right, I was going to say, it has like an ancient civilization feel to it.
Well, Hitler and Albert Speer, they liked neoclassical architecture, so copying other great empires kind of fit in with that. Now, an interesting little side story, the original plan for Hitler's entry here on the VIP rostrum was he was going to enter the back side of the Golden Hall, come through these doors, walk down these stairs to the rostrum there. But Hitler never did that. And why? Hitler never came in the back door anywhere. The way Hitler made his entry is he came right down the front in his convertible Mercedes, giving everybody his famous salute, and walked up the front. That's the way the Fuhrer made his entry.
Standing up here, you just get a feel for the scale of this thing. It's huge. I mean, you can see a football pitch here. You could probably fit about 12 of them in this space.
You could fit 85,000 spectators around the field there on 3 sides, plus 15,000 more here on the VIP rostrum. And they had space for up to 250,000 participants in the field.
So this thing could hold, what, over 300,000?
Correct.
That's an extraordinary amount of people.
That's over 6 times the capacity of New York's Yankee Stadium.
You can imagine how thundering it must have sounded with people all shouting in unison, Heil! Heil!
The noise must have been just deafening.
Hitler was viewed sort of as this almost godlike savior who was going to bring Germany into the forefront, was going to create the master race.
And what Speer provided was a kind of massive cathedral to Nazism. You know, your eye is drawn to one man alone. That, of course, would have been Adolf Hitler.
So Hitler would have come along here.
Correct.
Mounted these steps.
Yes.
And then he would have stood, what, right here?
Right here in the center.
And delivered his speeches to the masses from this spot.
Exactly. And you can imagine standing here, everybody saying Heil.
Those people screaming your name out.
Yeah, you'd feel like God standing up here.
It is a monumentally huge stage for a monumentally huge ego, and it was Speer who created it.
In 1934, Hitler appointed Speer the Reich's chief architect, and the two became good friends.
They certainly formed a close relationship, and it may be that Hitler, as somebody who had had artistic ambitions and hadn't been able to realize them, saw in Speer somebody who was having the kind of career that he could have had, not as an artist, but as an architect.
Speer was given the opportunity to fulfill his wildest professional ambitions, and there were other benefits to being the Führer's architect.
Speer takes an enormous amount of personal wealth from all these projects that he's mandated to do by the Führer. You know, he is doing land deals, you know, and real estate deals on the back of all these state-sponsored projects. So he's feathering his own nest.
Speer's rapid rise through the Nazi ranks was unprecedented among Hitler's followers. Throughout the late 1930s, he lived a life of privilege and luxury, never far from the Führer's side. During the war, Hitler rewarded Speer's loyalty by appointing him Minister of Armaments, entrusting him with the vital task of keeping the German war machine rolling. Albert Speer reached heights in the Reich that few Nazis could boast. Given what Speer's monument to megalomania now represents, you have to question its continued existence.
Why not tear it down?
There's two camps. Okay, there's one camp that says, you know, let it, you know, deteriorate into dust. Let's tear it down. Let's use it for something else. And then you have the other camp that says we have to maintain it to make sure that the things that happened here under National Socialism don't happen again. There's actually graffiti on the Golden Hall here that says "Nie wieder Krieg," which means never again war.
But just as the city of Nuremberg played host to Speer's rise, it was also the site of both his and the Nazi Party's fall.
Those top four windows on the front of the building here, that's where the Nuremberg trials took place.
All right, so they happened right there.
Correct.
It's in this building that the true character of Hitler's best friend emerged.
I swear by God that I will speak the pure truth.
I'm in Nuremberg with historian Kevin Hoskins on a mission to find out where Nazi architect Albert Speer ranks in Hitler's hierarchy of evil.
This is the portion of the complex here known as the Justice Palace. And room 600, those top four windows on the front of the building here, that's where the Nuremberg trials took place.
All right, so they happened right there.
Correct.
On November 20th, 1945, a little over 6 months after Germany surrendered, 22 of the Führer's highest-ranking accomplices were put on trial, including Albert Speer.
Hermann Wilhelm Göring.
If found guilty, most of the defendants faced death by hanging. One by one, they pled innocent. Next came Hitler's armaments minister,
Albert Speer.
Speer faced 4 charges relating to his actions during wartime, which many believed helped prolong the deadliest conflict in modern history.
Speer, managed to increase munitions production. In doing so, he increased Germany's capacity to fight, and in doing so, lengthened the war.
In his plea, Speer towed the line with his other defendants.
Nicht schuldig. Speer is indicted under all 4 counts.
But when it came to his defense, he shocked everyone in the court.
I swear by God that I will speak the pure truth.
Es wäre ihm nahezu gelungen, mittels seines technischen Vorsprungs Europa zu unterwerfen.
He railed against Hitler for his despotic actions and warned the world about leaving future fascists unchecked.
Je technischer die Welt wird, umso größer ist diese Gefahr.
Speer even went on to do something none of his co-accused were willing to.
Speer gets this reputation from these trials as the Nazi who said sorry. Can you tell me about that?
Well, that comes from a couple of things. One, he was the only guy in the first trial that actually showed any kind of remorse.
He also presented himself as largely ignorant of the Holocaust and of the extent of the persecution and attempted extermination of Jews.
I think what he was primarily trying to do there was distance himself from the other defendants, because at this point it was like rats on a sinking ship. It was every man for himself. And he figured that his best bet for getting through this was to cooperate. What that did was it gave the prosecution an idea. You know, this guy, he's breaking away from the pack, so maybe we can use him as a wedge against the other guys. So that's what happened.
Die Streitigkeiten zwischen Saugel und mir zu beenden.
Speer presented evidence against the Reich and even his fellow defendants. In the dock, they were disgusted by his actions.
Speer cooperated with the prosecution, did a little snitching, also was credited with providing the court with the most realistic view of Nazi Germany.
His extraordinary testimony climaxed with a bombshell. Speer told the court that as the Allies closed in on Berlin, he concocted a plan to assassinate Hitler to end the conflict and save the German people from any further death and destruction.
Speer famously goes to the Führer bunker in the very dying days of the war and goes and has his last, somewhat tortured meeting with Hitler. Speer will later claim that he was minded to introduce poison gas into the Führer bunker in order to kill everybody.
But on further questioning, Speer could only offer a string of flimsy excuses to explain why his plan failed.
Speer spun fables. We know that this is a lie. Much of what Speer was saying was absolute nonsense.
It was all part of a desperate attempt to save his own neck.
The tribunal has considered the whole of this evidence with great care.
On October 1st, 1946, the verdicts were announced.
The tribunal finds that Speer is not guilty on counts 1 and 2, but is guilty under counts 3 and 4.
Speer was convicted of capital crimes, but when the judges handed down their sentence, he found his cooperation had paid off.
Instead of getting the noose, like I personally believe he deserved, all he got was 20 years in Spandau.
Albert Speer was going to prison.
His acceptance of a collective responsibility and his willingness to serve as a star witness against some of the other leading Nazis probably saved his life.
Of the 22 men on trial, only 3 were acquitted. 12 were sentenced to death by hanging, and 7, including Speer, were given jail time. Speer was incarcerated at Spandau prison in West Berlin. He'd spend the next 20 years behind bars. But what's the real story behind Hitler's Minister of Armaments? To find out, I'm heading to Germany's capital, Berlin.
How is Speer connected to this place?
It's a camp for forced laborers.
How are you going to produce as many weapons in the shortest time possible? You're going to need slaves.
There must be a light around here somewhere.
Yeah, there is, yeah.
Oh,
okay, I switch it on. Yeah.
My mission to determine where Albert Speer ranks in Hitler's hierarchy of evil has brought me to Berlin.
Berlin was, of course, a huge spot for production.
I've come to this former work camp to meet historian Magnus Bracken to learn more about Albert Speer's actions as armaments minister during the war.
So what exactly is this camp and what was its function?
It's a camp for forced laborers, and the function was to provide a labor force for armaments production and other workforce. You will find them all over Germany,
right?
Because forced labor was a very basic part of keeping the war running.
Slave labor was absolutely crucial to the Nazi economy, and the man who used it more than anyone else was Albert Speer. His role as armaments minister is to try and produce as many weapons as possible. Well, how are you going to produce as many weapons in the shortest time possible? You're going to need slaves. There is no other way he has of doing it, because he sure as hell ain't going to pay them.
And how is Speer connected to this place?
This special camp in 1943, Italian forced laborers have been working here, and these were people who actually came into the realm of Speer because Italy changed sides in September 1943, and Speer immediately took the opportunity to get control.
But for Speer, amassing slave laborers was about much more than just maximizing production.
This is an important aspect of Speer in general, to be in control over forced labor, to get control of as many people as possible, to have the reflection of power that this represents. The more people he has, the more power he has within the National Socialist system.
This barrack complex would have been used to house the laborers here.
Yeah, I think it was up to 2,700. And it's, of course, narrow, dark. If you imagine people crammed here, constantly hungry, and 12-hour working shift.
There must be a light switch in here somewhere.
Yeah, there is.
Inmates here also lived with the constant fear of being hit by Allied bombers that targeted Berlin.
Is this a bomb shelter?
Yeah, well, it's a cellar, which was obviously used as a bomb shelter. Right. But you can imagine when you are in here and there's just a few centimeters of concrete above you, and then there's the barrack above this, that if a bomb hits this place, there is not much protection. And if you have a hit close by and everything falls on top of this.
You've been buried alive down here.
Exactly, yes. Yeah. Places like this were all over Europe where people had to work in one way or another for Speer and for his huge empire of production during the war.
Punishment consists of starvation.
At the Nuremberg trial, the prosecution presented eyewitness accounts of the horrors laborers endured.
Proper medical treatment or care for the sick are not available in the mass camps. The consequence is complete exhaustion, an ailing state of health, and tuberculosis. There are cases of 8-year-old delicate and undernourished children put to forced labor and perishing from such treatment. We shall show that the defendants Sauckel and Speer are principally responsible for the formulation of the policy and for its execution.
Fritz Sauckel was Speer's subordinate, in charge of rounding up slave laborers. When faced with the death sentence, Speer pointed the finger of blame at Sauckel alone.
Und Sauckel ließ sich dazu den Auftrag geben, 3,5 Millionen Arbeitskräfte aus den besetzten Gebieten zu holen. Dabei gab Hitler schärfste Weisung über OKW an die Militärbefehlshaber, den Forderungen Sauckels mit allen Mitteln nachzukommen. Waren Sie mit dieser Entscheidung einverstanden? Nein, keineswegs.
Speer managed. At Nuremberg, he switched it around and says, well, I was only the armaments minister. I had nothing to do with forced labor people. That was Sauckel. He had the task by Hitler to get these people from all over Europe. I was not connected to this.
Blindsided by Speer's betrayal, Sauckel desperately tried to lie his way out of a guilty verdict.
In meinem eigenen Aufgabengebiet immer alles daran gesetzt, Ausschreitungen, Willkür, Rohheit jeder Art zu verhindern. Gott schütze ein über alles geliebtes Volk.
But it didn't work.
Sauckel is indicted on all 4 counts. On counts 1 and 2, he is guilty. On
Based on Speer's testimony, Fritz Sauckel was convicted of crimes against humanity and hanged.
It's an interesting story to see how he got away with it and why he got away with it and why people for many decades were prepared and even keen to believe what he said.
Albert Speer convinced the judges at Nuremberg that he was just a civil servant who had no direct hand in Nazi atrocities.
All right, so what have you got here?
In reality, the trial never brought to light the true nature of his commitment to the regime.
Das ist also eine groß angelegte Planung für die Umgestaltung Berlins.
So if the Nazis had won the war, this would have been the capital of the world.
Or the vile lengths he would go to achieve his aims.
More than 55,000 Jews were victims of mass deportations out of Berlin.
I'm in Berlin on a mission to find out where Nazi architect Albert Speer sits in Hitler's hierarchy of evil. At the Nuremberg trials, Speer portrayed himself as a reluctant participant in Hitler's dream of worldwide domination. But there are those who know otherwise.
Ja, ich wollte hier mal ein sehr ungewöhnliches und auffälliges Bauwerk zeigen hier.
You can't really see it through the trees here.
Hartmut Gratz is a historian and an expert on the architectural history of Berlin.
So what exactly is this structure?
Ein Vollbetonzylinder, er wiegt also 16.000 Tonnen, der also hier einfach hingestellt wurde, gebaut wurde, um den Druck des Erdbodens zu testen für ein großes Bauwerk, nämlich für den sogenannten Triumphbogen.
In June 1940, the German army seized Paris. Hitler made a special one-day trip to the French capital to see its architectural wonders. Among the select group with him that day was Albert Speer. The two were looking for ideas for the Führer's plan to remake Berlin into the ultimate Nazi capital.
I mean, Hitler was obsessed with legacy. You know, Hitler knew that he was going to die like any other person on this planet, but what he wanted to leave behind was something that was almost indelible, or at least going to last 1,000 years. What lasts a long time? Big buildings last a long time, and you don't get bigger buildings than what Hitler and Speer designed for their new world capital, Germania. They saw themselves as the two men alone had a vision for what the Third Reich was going to look like in the next century and the century beyond that.
Das ist also eine groß angelegte Planung für die Umgestaltung Berlins. Die Idee, der Traum, den hat Hitler. In den 20er Jahren skizzierte zum Beispiel eine große Halle und einen Triumphbogen.
In Paris, Hitler and Speer drive past the city's famed Arc de Triomphe and take notes.
Es ist groß, es ist gigantisch, es soll Menschen einschüchtern.
Germania's planned arch would be so heavy, Speer was worried it would actually sink into the ground. But even the arch was dwarfed by their plans for the domed Volkshalle.
When you're looking at the grand hall he designed for Germania, you know, it was so big that all the breath would have created clouds in it, and it would have actually rained inside. The thing about Speer's thinking, architecturally, is that actually it doesn't really work on a human scale. And it shows that ultimately Speer didn't really have an appreciation of humanity.
I think a common characteristic of the Nazi mindset at the time was that they were, in fact, the superior race. There's this collective narcissism. There's this collective understanding that they were worthy of adulation. I think that Speer's buildings demonstrate this.
Hitler hat gesagt, die große Halle, ja, da sollte ursprünglich oben der Adler sein, der das Hakenkreuz in den Klauen hat. Und er hat die Planung umgeändert. Er hat gesagt, der Adler soll die Weltkugel in den Klauen haben. Sie sagen eigentlich damit, hier ist der Mittelpunkt der Welt. Es ist also ein steingebauter Rassismus eigentlich.
Speer's huge monuments to Hitler would have stood along the so-called Avenue of Splendors, dwarfing everything around them.
So you'd arrived, you'd see these ginormous buildings, and then right at the end you'd see the Volkshalle.
Ja, das damals das größte Gebäude der Welt werden sollte.
And what's this building here in red?
Das ist der Reichstag.
So that's the Reichstag that's standing now.
Ja.
So that just gives you an idea. That's what they wanted to build, how much bigger that is than the Reichstag.
Ja.
That's extraordinary.
Ja, das ist eine reine Kulisse, nur Kulisse eigentlich für die große Inszenierung des Nationalsozialismus.
In 1937, 3 years before their Paris tour, Hitler had appointed Speer, Berlin's chief building inspector, to prepare the city for its mighty transformation. Speer's master plan meant tens of thousands of Berlin households would have to be demolished to make way for construction. That would have deadly consequences.
So we're on the bank of the Spree right now, and on the other side is the Reichstag.
Yes.
And so
I've come to meet historian Susanna Willems to find out more.
I wanted to take you to these Stolpersteine, the commemoration for 10 people who used to live in one flat which was vacated in early 1941.
So he'd earmarked this area and other parts of the city to be demolished for the World Capital Germania
Yes.
Building to rehouse the people that were being evicted from this area. They were evicting Jews and rehousing these people here.
He convinced people in the Ministry for Economy that taking over the big flats of Jews would save a lot of money to the state. So he proposed it as a measure of saving public funds.
Really, really horrifying.
But Berlin's Jews weren't simply being evicted.
The commemoration is to Willy and Rosalie Hirsch, the tenants of one flat in the building.
Sobibor, the name at the bottom of these plaques, was an extermination camp in Nazi-occupied Poland. Between 1942 and 1943, the Nazis sent an estimated 250,000 Jews there to be killed in gas chambers.
And do we know how many Jews were victim of Speer's building plans?
At least 45,000.
Wow.
If Speer had slowed down and let aside his interest as a general building inspector, many of the Berlin Jews would have survived.
At Nuremberg, Speer claimed to know little of the concentration camps and what took place in them.
This document I discovered among the papers kept in Moscow in the special archives.
In her own investigation, Susanna traveled to Moscow, where she gained access to captured Nazi documents that shed new light on Speer and the Holocaust. It's the record of a meeting he attended in 1941.
So you have here Reichsminister Professor Speer sitting with SS-Obergruppenführer Pohl, and then personnel of Speer and the SS.
Right, okay.
And one topic is enlargement of the camp of barracks in Auschwitz following the deportations to the east.
Auschwitz in southern Poland was the biggest and most notorious of all the Nazi camps. More than 1 million people were sent to their deaths there between 1940 and 1945.
The result of this conversation was Reichsminister Professor Speer has allowed it, and he has assigned 13.7 million Reichsmark. You find here 4 Leichenhallen gas chambers.
So this is an order for 4 gas chambers for
Yes.
Auschwitz.
Yes.
And this is from the money that Speer is allowing them to use.
Yeah.
So this document shows that Speer not only knew about Auschwitz, but he's involved in its actual physical expansion.
Yes.
Wow. So he not only knew about the Holocaust, but he was directly involved in the extermination of Jews.
Yeah, the program was actually called Special Program Professor Speer.
Oh my God.
None of this evidence was submitted at Nuremberg. Once again, Speer's carefully constructed lies covered up his crimes. But Speer's story still contains one final secret that lies buried in a place that can only be described as hell.
You only have to look at Mittelbau Dora to realize quite how evil Albert Speer really was.
I'm on a mission to find out where Albert Speer ranks in Hitler's hierarchy of evil.
The tribunal finds that Speer is not guilty on counts 1 and 2.
Hitler's architect managed to convince the Nuremberg court that he was innocent of crimes against humanity.
Speer was a brilliant liar, and he was also a brilliant actor. You know, he played this role of the kind of apologetic, gentlemanly, quote-unquote, good Nazi, you know, to the absolute maximum, and it worked.
I'm on my way to a place that will prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, just how guilty he was. This is Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp in central Germany. It doesn't look very imposing at first glance, until you discover that most of the camp is underground.
It's incredibly cold, and it's damp. It's got a musty smell about it.
It's here that Albert Speer committed atrocities that almost defy imagination. By 1943, the Allies were launching regular bombing raids on German factories making weapons and ammunition. To keep the Nazi war machine running at full steam, Speer took production underground.
Wow, look at the size of this place. It's huge.
In all, 60,000 inmates were forced to work down here in conditions that were utterly inhumane.
People were basically forced to be, you know, troglodytes living underground for months at a time.
This camp also stands out as it was a key production facility for one of the most powerful weapons of the entire war.
This is an engine from a V2 rocket, and that's what they were assembling down here in these tunnels.
The V2 rocket was the world's first long-range ballistic missile. It had a guidance system that enabled it to hit targets up to 200 miles away. Hitler unleashed the V2 on the cities of Western Europe and Britain in September 1944, causing devastating damage and mass civilian casualties. It was the Führer's last, desperate attempt to prolong the war and remain in power. But to make that happen, he needed a steady supply of V2s to hurl at them.
Look at this. Parts of rockets. So this is clearly chamber 44, one of the chambers where the laborers were forced to build armaments. At one point, 1,000 laborers were forced to live in this small chamber.
Slaves worked and slept down here for months on end, using barrels for a latrine.
Speer visited Mittelbau-Dora personally, so any denial on Speer's part of knowing the extent of the conditions and the suffering there is a complete lie.
Laborers were regularly worked to death, building a weapon that in reality didn't pay off.
The big irony about the V2 rocket is that more people were killed making that rocket than were killed by that rocket. You only have to look at the grim statistics of Mittelbau-Dora to realize what a horrific place it was. Between 43 and 45, 60,000 people were sent there, and only 20,000 got out alive. That's 40,000 deaths right on Albert Speer's doorstep.
Ooh. And these look like stretchers used to bring the dead bodies of the inmates up here. Ooh. So these are the ovens. Oh, shit. I must admit, I feel physically sick being so close to these ovens, knowing what they were made for, specifically for burning the bodies of inmates who had died here. It's like there's artwork on these walls, flowers. It's so strange to see artwork on the walls of a crematorium.
Ultimately, Speer never shared the fate of the thousands who died behind the camp walls. He was released from Spandau prison on October 1st, 1966, to adoring crowds and an enthusiastic press.
What I find extraordinary is that Albert Speer emerges from Spandau after 20 years imprisonment, and he becomes the kind of darling of the talk show circuit. And he's even interviewed by Playboy magazine.
Speer was now widely known as having been Hitler's closest confidant. This made him a hot commodity in a world still fascinated with the man who dragged it to the brink of total destruction. The newly freed Speer was only too happy to give the people what they wanted, with an extra helping of wit and charm.
The fact that before 1945 he seems to be one person, and after 1945 he portrays himself as a completely different person suggests a skillfulness in being able to manage multiple impressions, which is not something that everybody can necessarily do.
Speer died in 1981 at age 76. To many, he remained the Nazi who saw the light, a lone, noble figure among some of history's worst criminals.
He sold the world a massive lie that he was essentially a decent man caught up in a very, very kind of compromising position. No, he willingly became friends, with the most evil man of the 20th century. He was a key component of the Nazi regime. I think he was a thoroughly detestable and evil man.
Now it's time for me to find out where that man ranks in Hitler's hierarchy of evil.
And there's a question about whether the person who does it because he's truly devoted to the cause, or the person that does it because self-benefit is worse. Which one is truly worse?
My mission to Germany has given me new insight into Albert Speer's involvement in both the Nazi war effort and the Holocaust. It's also exposed the many lies he told to escape the death penalty and whitewash his legacy. Now it's time for us to decide where he should sit in the hierarchy of evil. Using our unique system of playing cards, I want to know where Speer ranks in Hitler's Most Wanted.
One of the places I visited was the Nuremberg rally grounds, which Speer obviously designed. How important a moment was that for Speer?
It's hugely important. The scale and the scope of those rally grounds are also reflected in Speer's plans to remake Berlin into the world capital Germania. You see these plans for grandiose, monstrous buildings, and that shows this shared obsession that Speer and Hitler had of Germany as a power that would dominate the world.
His grandiose plans for developing Berlin lead to hundreds, thousands of Jews being thrown out of the German capital. Where do they end up? Being killed in concentration camps. The line between a Jew being murdered and Speer is a direct one.
In his memoirs, Speer denied being an anti-Semite and a true believer in Nazi ideals. But even if this was true, would it absolve him of his role in the Reich's crimes against humanity?
Of all the places I visited, the place that had the biggest impact on me was the Mittelwerk tunnels, where thousands of slave laborers were forced to build weapons for the Nazi war machine.
When you went to those tunnels, you saw what Speer didn't want you to see. Speer wanted the world to believe that he was a technocrat, that he was swept along by the currents of history, that he wanted to do his job, be an architect, and didn't have political impulses, didn't have political convictions, and didn't know about the atrocities that were going on.
In his roles as building inspector and armaments minister, Albert Speer caused the deaths of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people. Yet his carefully conceived lies convinced his accusers that he was an innocent man.
Speer would love to be remembered. He'd love to be remembered as the Nazi who was welcome at salons, the Nazi who didn't know what was going on, the cultured and cultivated Nazi. We have to dispense with all of that.
It sounds as though everything after 1945 is a falsehood, is a lie. Well, and that deflection of responsibility is psychologically important to be able to cope with the atrocities that one commits.
I think that actually Speer's lying and this presentation of seeming innocence after the war also helps Germany and a lot of Germans come to terms with what took place in Germany. It makes them feel, well, if Speer is innocent, then the average German could also feel innocence.
We think of Joseph Goebbels, propaganda minister, as the greatest liar the world's ever known. He wasn't. Albert Speer was.
He was one of the very worst guys. And the fact that his deputy got hanged at Nuremberg and he didn't shows you quite what he got away with.
So now I'd like to come to a conclusion as to where we think he ranks in the Nazi hierarchy of evil. Guy?
Well, I'm putting him really high because it really annoys me that Speer has got away with it for all these decades. I'm going to give him a 6.
Anthony?
If you're talking about a militaristic regime and wars of aggression, the armaments minister has to rank high. Add to that his role in the Holocaust, and he's a 6.
I'm surprised, truthfully. I instinctively, from what I know and from the psychology of it, I would have ranked him lower, but I'll defer to the historians on this one.
I completely agree with you guys. I think that the myth that he created after the war has gone on for far too long, and he is definitely 6. It makes him the King of Hearts. Albert Speer's deception is one of the most outrageous injustices to come out of World War II. For that, and the monstrous crimes he committed in the name of the Nazi regime, he ranks 6 in Hitler's hierarchy of evil. Josef Mengele, the notorious demon doctor of Auschwitz.
This is all that remains of one of the 4 gas chambers here. And right next to the gas chamber was Mengele's lab.
Here, he conducted barbaric experiments on innocent victims.
The fact that he experimented on children earns him an even deeper place in hell.
Once he was finished, he murdered his victims to further his twisted pseudoscience.
Mengele dissected the bodies and collected the eyes and sent them for research.
What so corrupted a medical doctor that he went down in history as the angel of death? Most people from my generation don't understand how over 70 years ago, a small group of Nazis could start a war that killed 60 million people. I want to find out, and to help me, I'm going to use playing cards. Today, they're used by both the military and law enforcement to help identify their targets. But nobody has ever put together a pack of cards for the most notorious group of killers in history. Working with experts, I want to know where each of these Nazis rank in the hierarchy of evil. My name is James Ellis. This is Hitler's Most Wanted. Josef Mengele has become the poster boy for Nazi medical experiments. What is it about Mengele that makes him so notorious? Guy.
Mengele was not the only Nazi doctor carrying out this kind of work, quote unquote. And the reason why we think about him is because he got away with it.
A lot of the underlying ideas behind Mengele's experiments were in line with scientific thinking of the day on issues like race and eugenics. What was not in line with the scientific thinking of the day were the practices.
Well, there's no question that his work was unethical. But one of the things we need to consider is the distinction between the ethics of the science and the validity of the science. They're not the same thing. We can have very ethical science that is conducted poorly, and we can have scientific research that's conducted very well, but it's completely unethical. What we really need to consider is the extent to which Mengele's science is either ethical or valid, and it may be neither.
His job is supposed to be saving lives, yet he's carrying out some of the most horrific atrocities that the Nazis committed. What is it that allowed him to do that? To answer the question, I'm starting my investigation in Günzburg, the picturesque German town where he grew up.
There's obviously a kindergarten to our left, because I can hear the kids.
Yeah, that's right. That's the building over there.
I've come to meet with historian Sven Keller to find out about Mengele's early life and how he became a Nazi.
This is a children's playground.
Yeah, the Ruth Mengele playground, actually.
So it's named after a member of the Mengele family?
Yeah, it's named after the wife of one of the brothers of Josef Mengele. Locally, the Mengele family was always known for their largesse, for making social donations, like many well-to-do families.
Since the early 20th century, the Mengeles have been one of the most important benefactors in town, and several local landmarks bear the family name.
Is it just me, or is it really creepy that there's the Mengele name stamped onto this children's fort in a playground named after a member of the Mengele family, and Josef Mengele carried out heinous experiments on children in Auschwitz?
Well, I'm actually with you there. What makes it especially creepy for me is that there's a Jewish woman from Auschwitz who suffered from experiments from Mengele. Mengele kept her from feeding her newborn child in order to see what would happen to the child, how long it could live until it starved. In the end, the Jewish woman thwarted Mengele by silently killing her own child at night. This Jewish woman bore the same name, Ruth, as Ruth Mengele. This connection, that's something I can't get out of my head.
It's absolutely horrifying.
Yeah.
So obviously the Mengele family are a big deal in this town. Can you tell me a bit more about them?
This was a very respected family. They came up from nothing. They were like self-made men. That was something that people admired.
Josef Mengele was born in 1911 into a conservative Catholic family. His father, Karl, ran a successful farm equipment company that grew to become the second largest employer in town.
And what was Josef Mengele like as a kid? What do we know about him?
That's not so easy to answer. There are not very many sources. The people that grew up with him, they describe him as likable.
Was there anything that was happening in his childhood, anything that he was doing that sort of hinted at the horrific actions he would partake in later in his life?
Not at all.
None at all?
I would say, not at all, no.
So he was just a normal kid growing up in an affluent family in this nice town in Bavaria?
Yeah, that's what I would say, yeah.
Throughout Josef's adolescence, the Mengele business continued to grow, as did the family's influence over the town. In the early 1930s, Hitler visited Günzburg twice to drum up support for the party, even giving a speech at the Mengele factory on his second trip. By 1933, Karl Mengele had bribed his way onto the town council.
So this street is named after Josef Mengele's father?
That's Josef Mengele's father, yes.
I can't think of another notorious Nazi whose family name exists on a street sign. I mean, why wouldn't they just get rid of it now?
Yeah, this is this very complex relation the town has with this family.
Yeah.
With the family being so respected and giving donations, it was very hard for the city to get a distance. Me personally, I would get rid of the name.
As successful as the Mengeles were, Josef chose not to follow in his father's footsteps.
How did Mengele get set on his path to become a doctor?
He graduated from high school in 1930, and he wasn't made for the family career. How that decision was made exactly, frankly, we don't know. But he went to Munich and started to study medicine.
Munich was the center of the Nazi movement during the 1930s. Once Hitler became chancellor in 1933, Jewish scholars and scientists were dismissed from the universities and replaced by Nazi sympathizers. These were the academics who taught and influenced Josef Mengele.
Mengele was an incredibly hard-working young man, and when he was doing his degree, he also did a doctorate in anthropology.
In medicine, he wasn't so much interested in the clinical part of it.
Okay.
He went for this quite new, sparkling branch of medicine called genetics.
Okay.
And obviously, genetics and anthropology were both sciences that were pretty much connected to what National Socialism did with their racist theory.
Wow. So he was potentially radicalized while he was studying at university.
Yeah. It would be much easier if you could say, well, this was a madman from the beginning.
Yeah, but you can't.
Would be much easier, but you can't.
In 1937, Mengele took a coveted research assistant position at the Institute for Hereditary, Biology, and Racial Purity in Frankfurt. Here, he joined geneticists studying twins in a department at the forefront of Nazi racial programs.
It sounds to me as if these racial ideas are sort of mainstream academia in Germany at that time.
Yeah, mainstream, but also at the very kind of bleeding edge of academic research. He hoped this would be a career boost by concentrating on those sciences.
Mengele joined the Nazi Party in 1937, and his advancement in the medical profession paralleled his advancement through the Nazi ranks. In fact, in 1938, the same year that Mengele received his medical degree, he also joined the SS.
At that time, at the latest, he seems to have fully embraced the regime.
That regime would soon allow Mengele to commit some of the most despicable crimes of the Second World War.
Are those eyes?
Josef Mengele. He dissected the bodies and collected the eyes for research. It's really disturbing.
I'm in the southern German town of Günzburg with historian Sven Keller, tracing the origins of Josef Mengele's sadistic pseudoscience.
What I actually wanted to show you is this memorial here. This is for the victims of Josef Mengele.
This is, oh. Are those eyes?
Those are eyes, yes.
Because of Mengele's fascination with eye color, he ended up removing the eyes from many of his victims. And that's why the memorial to Mengele's victims that was erected in his hometown of Günzburg consists of many, many eyes.
In one particularly evil experiment, Mengele attempted to change eye pigmentation in 36 children. He injected them with colored dyes, causing excruciating pain and blindness. When it was all over, Mengele had no further use for the children and sent them to the gas chamber.
I like this memorial, and what I also like is that it was made by students from local high schools.
Really?
Yeah, they came up with this idea of using the eyes of Mengele's victims to get a connection to the person looking at this memorial, and at the same time address this history of the town, this part of their town's past. And I think that's the way to do it.
Yeah, amazing, especially getting kids to do it. So they're at a young age, they're learning about the history of Mengele and what he did.
Yeah, and learning about the victims and taking the perspective of the victims, yeah.
So what impact does it have on you to study someone like Mengele and to really analyze his life and his crimes?
We need to understand how people like Mengele became what they became, why they did what they did, and how it was all possible. Because if we don't understand why these people committed those crimes, it may happen again.
What kind of world would allow young doctors like Mengele to commit atrocious crimes? What opened the door to this gruesome, mad science? To find out, I'm headed to Berlin, the former scientific center of Nazi Germany.
Alexandra, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I'm meeting Dr. Alexandra Lovenau, a historian and expert on eugenics during the Third Reich.
The eugenics movement was all about destroying or eliminating mental diseases and not only mental diseases but also physical deformations.
Eugenics is a set of beliefs and practices that aim at improving the genetic composition of the human race. Today, this type of negative eugenics is obviously seen as quite repugnant.
In the 1930s, the Nazis turned to eugenics to help realize Hitler's dream of a master race. They started by weeding out so-called defective Germans. Less than 6 months after Hitler took power, any German who was disabled, mentally ill, or diagnosed with a hereditary disease was forced to undergo sterilization.
So about 400,000 people were sterilized. Mentally ill people were not allowed to reproduce, to have babies.
But preventing so-called worthless Germans from having children wasn't enough for the Fuhrer.
Not only did the Nazis want to stop mentally and physically ill people from reproducing, they wanted to eliminate any need to spend resources on caring for them.
The Nazi government decided that it simply is too costly to keep them alive.
Therefore, they should be murdered.
Yes. They started with children below 3 years old.
Who was killing the children?
These were physicians.
Mengele is very much part of the kind of Nazi medical community, which actually thinks that anybody who is disabled or quote-unquote defective in some way should be put to death.
In 1939, Hitler ordered gas chambers added to 6 designated institutions. Patients deemed unfit to live were sent there to be killed. It was a clandestine operation, later named Action T4.
However, it was basically impossible to keep it as a secret.
Hitler couldn't afford a public backlash during wartime. Action T4 was cancelled in August 1941, but the Nazis ordered physicians to continue the slaughter in a more concealed manner.
What brings someone who is in a profession that's supposed to heal people and save lives, what brings them to commit mass murder?
Majority of T4 Action physicians were relatively young, like Mengele. These are people who graduated in the mid-30s. Students were told not to waste your time, energy, and career on trying to help people who could not be helped, because they're not going to improve.
Right up until the end of the war, Nazi doctors murdered another 200,000 people.
This is totally chilling, because the idea that any human being who's not perfect in some way is regarded as being a drain upon the rest of humanity. And the idea that if you eliminate all these people, you either murder them or you sterilize them, that you're actually going to make humanity better is obviously completely evil, because it's not accepting the fact that human beings aren't perfect.
After the Reich's most vulnerable citizens were murdered by the very people sworn to look after them, Nazi physicians took their inhumanity a step further.
In some cases, it also happened that the researchers would visit killing centers and examine patients themselves, still living patients. And if they found someone interesting, the brain of that person would have been delivered.
You're saying they would select someone and say, you know, I want to examine that person's brain. And so that person was murdered in order for them to conduct experiments on their brain.
Yes. And in fact, it was seen as a great opportunity, a never-ending source of research material.
That's horrifying.
It is indeed, yeah. So that makes the euthanasia action even worse, and the involvement of researchers who were conducting scientific research on the brain makes them killers.
A lot of doctors were particularly enamored by the racial pseudoscience and phony ideology of the Nazi Party, because it blended in very well with a lot of kind of medical opinion at the time.
Mengele's scientific interests were never separate from the theories of racial science that were mainstream at the time, and specifically from Nazi ideas of racial hygiene.
This was the world Josef Mengele stepped into as an aspiring young doctor. He would soon embrace the Nazis' inhumane ideology with a chilling zeal.
He had absolutely no human feelings towards these children.
I'm on a mission to figure out where the notorious doctor, Josef Mengele, fits into Hitler's hierarchy of evil. I've come to the site of a former Nazi concentration camp at Sachsenhausen to meet someone who chose her career after coming across one of Mengele's victims.
Astrid?
Oh, James. Hi.
Very nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. How are you doing?
Dr. Astrid Ley is a historian and deputy head of Sachsenhausen Memorial and Museum.
So what was it that launched you into this field of study?
Actually, it was the encounter with a victim of Mengele's experiments that I had many years ago after I finished school. And for her, the most terrible thing was that she kind of didn't know how it affected her health. So I made it my goal to find out what the Nazi doctors did and tell it to the surviving victims.
Josef Mengele is the name people most associate with medical experiments in Nazi concentration camps and death camps. But obviously he wasn't the only doctor working in those places. How widespread was that practice?
It was a very widespread phenomenon. In all of the bigger camps, medical experimentation took place, and it started immediately after the Germans had begun the war.
The Nazis also encouraged medical experimentation to support the war effort.
Doctors were trying to cure injuries resulting from war by testing vaccines for infectious diseases that come up during the war, like hepatitis, like typhus.
The Führer offered up a deeply unsettling and vast new testing ground to unethical physicians like Josef Mengele, looking to make medical history.
For doctors and for ambitious researchers, ethical constraints on using human subjects could sometimes be frustrating. The concentration camp system provided subjects that doctors were free to experiment on as much as they wanted.
What sorts of medical experiments were taking place here?
At that time, hepatitis was not known like we know today, being a viral infection. So one doctor, what he did is that he went to Auschwitz, he selected with Mengele 11 Jewish boys. The boys were transferred to Sachsenhausen.
The boys were infected with tissue biopsied from German soldiers suffering from hepatitis.
We do have testimonies of a prisoner's nurse, a male nurse, who was describing how the boys were crying, what extreme pain and how they were frightened. And the doctor didn't seem to care. These Polish Jewish boys, for him, they were nothing better than guinea pigs.
During the war, a grisly array of medical experiments was conducted across 8 of the largest concentration camps.
How could a doctor whose job it is to care for people, how could they be so cruel?
Yeah, this is what we really don't understand. It shows an extreme ability to distance yourself from the suffering of your victim. And you can only do that when you don't consider this person being a human being.
Empathy is the ability to feel what another person is feeling. If you feel sad when you see another person sad, or you get scared when you see another person who's scared, that's empathy. It's quite clear that the Nazis didn't feel empathy because they dehumanized their victims to such an extent that they didn't feel empathy for those people.
The appalling way in which these experiments were conducted ultimately did next to nothing to advance medical science, except in a small handful of isolated cases.
Today we know that hepatitis is a viral disease because of this experimentation.
That's really disturbing. So the medical experiments were both for helping soldiers on the front line, but also as part of justification for Nazi racial ideology.
Yeah, definitely.
Josef Mengele would take this ideologically based research to another horrific level.
Mengele was interested in heredity. And at that time, a way to study heredity, to see which characteristics were environmental and which were inherited, was to look at twins.
And I'm guessing that twin research, was that something that was specific to Mengele, or was that something that was being done in the wider scientific field at that time?
It was something that was very acknowledged, and Mengele was, actually, he was not a nobody. He was one of the leading geneticists. In 1938, Mengele, in a book review he wrote about a twin study, he said, the biggest problem we have is that we can never dissect twins at the same time, because twin couples hardly ever die at the same time. So this is why he became a concentration camp physician. He went to Auschwitz because in Auschwitz he would have the chance of experimenting on testing, examining more twins, and he planned to later write about it, use it in order to make his scientific career.
To find out what exactly Josef Mengele did to make his scientific career, I need to go to the place most synonymous with his cruel legacy.
He used to visit the children with some sweets he was bringing just for them.
I'm on a mission to figure out where Dr. Josef Mengele fits in Hitler's hierarchy of evil. I've come to Poland to see the one place most closely associated with his sinister crimes.
Here we are at the entrance to Auschwitz, Birkenau. This camp is enormous. It sprawls as far as the eye can see.
Auschwitz is the most well-known Nazi concentration camp and a prevailing symbol of the Holocaust.
Right now we are in the main camp, so-called Stammlager, Auschwitz I,
Right.
which was actually the beginning of Auschwitz.
To learn exactly what role Josef Mengele played in the horrific crimes committed here, I'm meeting with historian Teresa Wątosiewicz.
Before the war, the barracks were Polish army base, and in 1940 they became another German concentration camp.
Auschwitz ends up becoming one of the largest Nazi concentration camps. It's originally on one site, but it actually ends up going to 3 separate sites, which cover about kind of 8 miles in distance.
Josef Mengele arrived in Auschwitz in May 1943. Why did he come here?
He was sent here after he kind of fulfilled his military duty as a doctor.
Mengele was an officer with the medical corps of the Waffen-SS, Hitler's most fanatical combat troops. He was wounded on the Eastern Front in 1942, and after recovery, requested a post to Auschwitz.
Josef Mengele was one of quite a few doctors at Auschwitz. When the trains came into Auschwitz, it was the job of one of these SS doctors, including Josef Mengele, to select the Jews as to who was going to go to the gas chambers and who was still fit enough to work. He literally was just going left, right, and whichever way you went determined whether you were going to be dead in a matter of minutes or whether you were going to live another day and maybe survive a few weeks until you were worked to death. So that was one of his primary roles. His other role was to use Auschwitz as an experimental laboratory to conduct his very twisted pseudoscience. Doctors like Mengele regarded a body of human people as essentially just that, a body. And if you could kind of excise the cancerous part of that body, i.e. the races you regard as being infectious, unclean, diseased, such as Jewish people, then you'd be doing the body itself a favor.
Here they started to send families. They started to send children. So having families meant to have the twins and triplets together for the experimentation.
The exact purpose of Mengele's research on multiples is still unclear, but it's widely believed he spared twins from the gas chamber because he hoped to find in them the secrets to genetically engineering Hitler's master race.
At the time, the genetic code was not fully understood. He was actually undertaking some of the introductory research into hereditary studies with twins.
Twins were regarded as useful for this kind of research because you could look at 2 people with identical genetic material and see what was the same about them and what was different. And so you could conclude which characteristics were influenced by the environment and which were inherited.
Mengele had to first differentiate which features were replicated and which showed some variation. Only then could he try to eliminate undesirable and so-called racially impure traits.
He used to visit the Roma children in Birkenau with some toys, with some sweets. He was bringing just for them.
He used to give them toys and sweets.
He did. This is how he was remembered.
So he would bring them toys and sweets,
Mhm.
and then he would take them and carry out his experiments on them.
This is true.
Once the children were inside Mengele's laboratory, the torture began. Crude surgeries, painful tests, needless amputations, wounds deliberately infected, and exposure to fatal disease were all routine.
Mengele was completely devoid of human feeling while he was conducting experiments that he thought were in the name of scientific progress, but he didn't care that they were incredibly cruel and inflicted untold suffering on his victims.
Scores of Mengele's victims died before he even finished experimenting on them. Those who survived rarely fared better.
For the very last step, the children were killed. So this is what happened for most of the children.
So after they'd been experimented on by Mengele, they were killed, and then someone conducted an autopsy on their bodies.
This is correct.
Clearly, it requires utter sadism to carry out experiments, on living people, and indeed to kill them just to find something out. There's an appalling story in which Mengele and one of the other Auschwitz doctors are arguing about whether a child has got tuberculosis, and Mengele maintains that he has, and the other doctor maintains that he doesn't. Mengele comes back an hour later and confirms that Mengele, was wrong. The child didn't have tuberculosis. How has he found that out? He's killed him and dissected him, just for the purposes of a medical discussion.
The majority of twins at Auschwitz died from Josef Mengele's experiments. Only a handful survived long enough to see the camp liberated by the Soviet army on January 27, 1945.
Like many people, I've read about this place. I've seen pictures and movies about it. But I didn't fully get the sheer scale and the extent of the suffering until I saw this place with my own eyes. It's something that I'll never forget.
Yet despite his sadistic crimes, the Nazi doctor from hell somehow slipped the net.
The fact that after the war he escaped, lived out his life, and there was no public reckoning is incredibly frustrating.
I'm in Berlin, meeting with historian Tobias Freimüller to find out what happened to Josef Mengele as Hitler's empire was crumbling.
So this is a memorial established in the late 80s.
Right.
And it represents the deportations mainly to Auschwitz.
What happened to Mengele when the Red Army was coming towards Auschwitz?
He left shortly before, and then he would travel westwards disguised as a Wehrmacht officer.
In June 1945, American forces captured Mengele among some 10,000 German troops on the run in Saxony. They scanned the POWs for Waffen-SS tattoos, but when Mengele had joined the SS, he decided not to get one.
So he was released under a different name. He started working as a farmhand in southern Germany for quite a long time.
Then the world began to learn of the barbaric crimes committed by Nazi doctors.
All of the defendants herein unlawfully, willfully, and knowingly participated in plans and enterprises involving the commission of war crimes and crimes against humanity.
There was actually a doctor's trial held in Nuremberg where doctors who had committed atrocities in the service of Nazism were put on trial.
Mengele knew he had to flee.
He hotfoots it down to Argentina, which is probably the most popular retirement destination for former Nazis.
Mengele lived under an alias for several years in Buenos Aires. Then in 1958, he married his brother's widow, a major shareholder in his father's company.
In order to do so, he needed his real name and his real passport and his real identity. And so he went to the German ambassador in Buenos Aires and got his German passport with his real name. You could find his name in the telephone book of Buenos Aires, and he lived there under his real name, yes.
And he obviously at that point wasn't frightened that people were going to track him down.
Absolutely.
Nazi hunting was carried out by the Allies for about 3 to 4 years, and then they stopped doing it because they ran out of inclination and indeed the ability to launch tens of thousands of manhunts. You know, it would be taken decades.
And at what point did people start trying to track him down and bring him to justice?
In the late 50s, finally, there was a warrant of arrest issued out.
In 1960, Israel's intelligence service, the Mossad, captured Adolf Eichmann in Buenos Aires. They set out to capture Mengele during the same operation. Spooked, Mengele fled to Paraguay, but the Mossad stayed on his trail, so he slipped over the border into Brazil.
From that point on, his life became much less comfortable. He had to change his houses a couple of times.
For more than 3 decades, Mengele's relatives in Günzburg had been complicit in helping the Nazi fugitive. They provided financial aid and denied knowing his whereabouts. Only his son was willing to confront his father about his crimes.
And when his son visited him in the mid-70s, he asked him about Auschwitz and he asked him about what he did. And the son later reported that his father did not show any insight, that he would still say that it was correct what he did and it was right what he did, and that there's no need to apologize for anything. And that's why his son then traveled back to Germany and never get back to him.
Really? So his son was so horrified by his father's, not only his crimes, but the way he justified those crimes, that he cut off communication with him.
And the father obviously had hoped that he could convince his son that he did the right thing back then.
And how did he die?
He had a stroke, but it took another 6 years until it was finally officially proved that it was him, that he was actually dead.
Mengele is only hunted properly in 1985, around the time of the 40th anniversary of the kind of end of Auschwitz, which was in January 45.
That's when German police raided the home of Mengele's childhood friend in Günzburg and found evidence of the doctor's death.
What's ironic about, Mengele's ultimate fate is that when his bones are dug up at this graveyard at a place called Embu in 1985, his skull is held up and shown to the world's media. And those bones now have ended up in a lab, where they're looked at by medical students. It's kind of fitting that he doesn't have a proper grave. He ends up in a laboratory.
At what point did he become this notorious figure that epitomizes so much of the evil of the Nazi regime?
I think it's basically because he performed so terrible medical experiments, and it's easy to picture this. It's not so easy to picture what Eichmann did, but it's easy to see that doing medical deadly research on twins, on children, or deciding which Jew should sent directly into the gas chamber and who is not, is something completely and deeply inhuman. So this was a monster, a picture of a monster that he had escaped, made the whole story even more interesting.
Mengele was never known to express any remorse or take any responsibility for his crimes. The fact that after the war he escaped, lived out his life, and died from having a stroke while swimming is incredibly frustrating. There was no public reckoning. There was no chance for the victims and the survivors to testify and to put their story before the world and to see some measure of justice dealt out to Josef Mengele.
Now that I know Josef Mengele's key role in the inhumane medical experiments conducted in the service of the racist Nazi regime, it's time to figure out where he stacks up in Hitler's hierarchy.
Auschwitz offers an environment unlike any other, a place where a physician can experiment on human beings with no moral retribution at all.
After retracing the story of Josef Mengele's murderous exploits through Germany and Poland, it's time for us to decide where this demon doctor fits in the hierarchy of evil. Using our unique system of playing cards, I want to determine where Josef Mengele ranks in Hitler's Most Wanted.
There's so many horrific elements to Mengele's story, but one that really stuck with me is the stories about him doing selections on the ramp at Auschwitz.
Yes, I think it's also important to remember that Mengele is one of many doctors in many camps carrying out this sort of work. I use the word doctors with inverted commas because I think you've actually given up deserving to be called a medical person if what you're doing is slaughtering people, essentially.
With the flick of his wrist, Josef Mengele held the power of life and death over so many innocent victims.
What led a physician from a wealthy and respectable family to carry out such a horrific act?
Mengele was incredibly ambitious, and he saw the work that he was doing at Auschwitz as having the potential to open doors for him for his future career. When he took that ambition and took the state of science and combined it with a complete lack of ethics and a lack of human feeling.
As well as ambition, he was motivated by a twisted form of anthropology. He really did think that certain types of people were inferior to certain other types of people. And that's what lay behind his research, and that's what led him ultimately to murder.
It's a terrible backwards ideology, but if you fit into that ideology and you believe it, you may in fact be capable of doing the horrific things that Mengele did.
Careerism and a warped racial worldview spurred Josef Mengele on to commit unimaginable atrocities.
It seemed to me that Auschwitz really opened the door, that it gave an opportunity for Mengele to take things to another level and really cross that ethical boundary.
He simply had an opportunity. He had human bodies that he didn't care about and wasn't concerned about ethically and morally, and he was given the opportunity to do anything he wanted to them.
Auschwitz offers an environment unlike any other that's almost ever existed in the world, a place where a physician can experiment on human beings with no moral retribution at all.
It's important to remember when evaluating Mengele and his crimes that there were doctors, even Nazi doctors in concentration camps who refused to participate in these activities. He did it willingly.
Working in the appallingly cruel Nazi camp apparatus, Josef Mengele saw himself above morality. His work was neither valid nor ethical. He coldly betrayed his Hippocratic oath, and what's worse, he was never held to account for his crimes.
What I'd like to do now is come to a conclusion as to where you think that Mengele should rank in the hierarchy of evil. Matt, let's start with you.
Well, as a scientist and a researcher, I'm particularly bothered by Mengele's research, his ideology, and his methods in particular. Regardless of his own outlook on his medicine, I have to rank him quite highly. I'm going to put him at 9.
Anthony.
If we were ranking based on cruelty, he'd be in the top 5. But we're ranking based on his centrality to the Nazi regime's atrocities. I'm not convinced that he was central. He was part of a system that spanned hospitals, universities, concentration and death camps. He was one among many. He's number 49.
Guy.
I'm going to score very differently to you, but almost identical reasons. I think that actually he is a symptom of an evil way of thinking. It was a way of thinking that actually we had to fight against, and it's actually partly why we went to war. His sadism and cruelty, of course, knows no bounds, but because I regard him as a symbol of all that was totally twisted about that way of thinking and about the regime, I am going to put him very high up, and I am going to put him at number 5.
So the three of you have very different perspectives. For me, it's very simple. We're talking about a hierarchy of evil, and I can't think of anything more evil than torturing and murdering children. So for me, he has to be in the top 10, and I agree with Matt here. He's number 9. He is the Queen of Spades.
Perhaps the most notorious Nazi fugitive of all, Josef Mengele has become the embodiment of pure evil. A physician pledged to heal who kills instead. The diabolical doctor from Auschwitz is a central figure in Hitler's Most Wanted.